Yeah, I'm going to talk about, my role is in school finance. I talk about, the role of money in schools and how and why it matters. I feel like so much of what I have to say these days really should be, this is obvious. I'm playing the role of Captain Obvious here, that money matters. I won't even really review the literature on that, but I will point out the fact that I did this report for Shanker Institute a couple of years ago. There's some new compelling information on the importance of school finance reforms in improving student outcomes. Some of that's reviewed in the front end of the article that's in the packet. Money matters. We know it matters, and the reality is that it matters in the same old basic ways in schools that it's always mattered. Money is what's needed to pay for the people, space, stuff, and time, the resources that go into providing decent schooling. And as a result, the equity of the distribution of those dollars matters in improving the equity of student outcomes, and the level or the adequacy relates to the adequacy of student outcomes that we can achieve. This stuff is fairly obvious, but we've had kind of a cloud thrown around it now for a good 15, 20, maybe 30 years or so that has tried to kind of obfuscate these relatively clear points about how and why money matters. I often say, and I think we write this in the report that I do with the Education Law Center of New Jersey, that equitable and adequate financing of schools is the prerequisite underlying condition for everything else. That we can't do the things we need and want to do to provide for good schools if we don't have the resources to do it. Some schools do, some schools don't. It's not that every school in this nation is dreadfully underfunded. But we have to keep this in mind, even as we start talking about types of reforms I might agree or disagree with. All of it takes the right amount of money to make it work correctly. But the political backdrop to all of this, of course, is to say that money doesn't matter. I could have been introduced as a snarky blogger. That would have been absolutely fine. This first slide comes from my Angry Andy post. Where Andrew Cuomo, it's these claims of money doesn't matter, we already spend way too much on everyone anyway. They don't know any political boundaries, really. We've got some great quotes here from Cuomo. We've got Rick Scott talking about it. Notice there's a little graph here that shows how about 2 decades ago Florida was near the national average, but has since kind of slid behind. And then we've got comments on federal funding, and that money doesn't matter. Socrates trained Plato on a rock. All we need is a rock. We don't need money. And what's really interesting, and I have forthcoming papers that delve into this kind of political rhetoric more deeply, but a lot of these arguments that money is irrelevant, doesn't matter, they're pervasive in the political context. They can all really be traced back, and this will eventually become a paper, they can all really be traced back to like 3 or 4 different sources of information, many of which are kind of intellectually bankrupt arguments about how and why money doesn't matter. A lot of it goes back to a couple of pieces that my friend and colleague Rick Hanyashek wrote in the late 80s, in which he did tallies of large numbers of relatively crude statistical correlational studies, did it as kind of a vote counting exercise, and said, some say yes, some say no, therefore the answer is there's no clear and obvious relationship. There's a cloud of uncertainty here. And that Hanyashekian cloud of uncertainty has been pervasive in the context of school finance litigation. Certainly it was a big part of the defense testimony in CFE. It's coming up in the defense testimony in the Connecticut CJEF case. And it was just a big part of the defense testimony in the small cities case against New York State. Disposed of, I think, fairly handily, in part on the line of questioning that asked Dr. Hanyashek, and how many of these 50 or so citations are to your own studies that simply rehash those same correlations, and I think it was about 36 or so out of the 50. There are also these misleading anecdotal tales of disaster, most of which are really actually just misleading, misrepresentative of how Kansas City, Missouri supposedly spent obscene amounts of money in the mid-90s under DSEG order, or how New Jersey districts spent all this money. Then there are, my favorite, and I go back and forth with Matt DiCarlo. I'm kind of bummed out that he's off in Poland this week, but Matt DiCarlo and I like to collect versions of what we call the graph. Here's one version of the graph. The graph, domestic version, there's also the graph international version. The graph domestic version is the one where we have education spending climbing and climbing and climbing on one axis with one scale. And then on an axis on the other side of the graph, we show that NAEP is flat. Of course, you can stretch these axes however you want to make one appear growing and one appear flat. And if you really wanted to show a relationship, you'd want to do, what was neat was that this blog Junk Graphs actually critiqued the Gates version of the graph, which I'm sure Bill Gates didn't make it himself, maybe he did, but what's really interesting is some of the language that's used in describing the graph is drawn directly from Hanyashek's own characterizations. This reference of virtually flat is a common phrase used to explain NAEP growth, which seems to relate back to Hanyashek's own writing in his characterizations of the graph. Students First has a version of the graph. Cato has an even more fun version of the graph. Theirs just looks at aggregate education spending, and it re-expresses NAEP scores as a percent change, which is really fun when you're talking about data that are kind of artificially scaled around a particular value somewhere in the hundreds, right? And then you've got a few points change here or there, which might be substantive, but as a percent of 200 or 300 is pretty small. So we've got a lot of rhetoric out there about how and why money doesn't matter. And that has been used to reinforce this era in which it's really no longer politically acceptable in state legislatures to ever consider, or in Congress, to consider raising taxes for anything or allocating additional money, because clearly there's already enough, if not too much, in the system. So as we move into the Great Recession, and I would argue we're not beyond this now. We've not made any progress. When we move into the Great Recession here, we have states dramatically cutting K-12 education funding, cutting state aid, finding clever ways to take those 2 years of the federal fiscal stabilization money, plug them in through the formulas disproportionately allocated to lower wealth districts as the formulas would dictate, but then when they pull it out, it ends up being those districts that got slammed the hardest because of the way the federal stabilization money was actually allocated. And of course, states came up with all these fun different names for what they would call it, so they didn't just call it a cut. It became like the gap elimination adjustment in New York, which is just it's a cut. And most states actually have reduced the percent of gross state product from 2007 to 2012. Most states have reduced the share of gross state product that they spend on schools in combined state and local revenue. Even more so in state aid alone, because a lot of the wealthier districts offset their state aid losses with local revenue increases. So it's not that state economies collapsed and the percent of their economies that they were spending on education went up so much that they had to bring it back under control. No, states during this period reduced the share of economic capacity that they were spending on K-12 education, and most did, and many did quite significantly compared to previous periods when that stayed relatively flat or even increased. As a result, and you can go to the School Funding Fairness Report that I do at schoolfundingfairness.org through the Education Law Center of New Jersey, most states we have a fairness index which measures the extent that money is targeted to higher poverty districts, districts with higher concentrations of child poverty between the ages of 5 and 17. Most states, more than half of the states, saw a reduction in the extent of targeting of funds to higher poverty districts. Some of those were states that already had relatively strong targeting, like New Jersey, which saw a substantial decrease in its targeting and is still decreasing its targeting of funding. Other states already had bad distributions to begin with and just got worse. The other thing that's been an ongoing issue is that the relative competitiveness of teacher wages, teachers compared to non-teachers at same age and degree level, considering only those with bachelor's and master's degrees in the census data, teacher wages continue to fall behind. Economic Policy Institute's done some nice pieces on this. Sean Corcoran, Sylvia Allegretto, I think the most recent's a couple years old now. But teacher wages continue to fall behind. We haven't seen the same extent of reductions in the total numbers of of teachers per 100 pupils. We have more of an even distribution across states there, but even that is still, it's more that they've suffered in the wage growth than in the total numbers of teachers, which is actually a common pattern when we see these oscillations. When we see the increases, we also tend to see, well, actually we see increases in number of people more so than the wage competitiveness going on. In a lot of cases, even what we're seeing over the, we've seen some pretty tough circumstances in the last 5 years, but there are a lot of cases where we really never saw improvement. These are just a couple examples that relate to a piece I did for Center for American Progress a couple of years ago. Maybe, I think it was about a year ago, where I talked about America's most financially disadvantaged school districts. School districts where we don't have to do any kind of fancy econometric analysis to see, well, what's their need and how far from it are they. These are school districts that just on their face, when you look at them, they have 2 to 3 times the average poverty of those around them, and significantly less state and local revenue per pupil, where we know that it requires greater state and local revenue per pupil to meet the needs in higher need settings, settings with greater poverty. Philadelphia in 1993 had almost double the poverty of its surroundings, 16% lower state and local revenue. By 11-12, it had more than double the poverty and 18% below the state and local revenue. Nothing ever got better in Philly. No one's really tried. You hear rhetoric about, well, we poured all this money into Philly. We've tried. We've done everything. We've given them all this extra funds to get the job done, and they just didn't do it. We need to dismantle them entirely. No, nobody ever tried in Philly. And I think if you went to Philly and asked the people, you know, in the schools there, they'd be able to convey that from ground level. Certainly nobody ever tried in Reading. Eastern Pennsylvania is one of the most inequitable parts of this country in school funding. Reading was about equal with its, well, it's 13% below its surroundings in 93, 94, 3 times the poverty. Its relative poverty went down because the poverty in the surroundings went up a little bit, and its poverty stayed relatively stable. But now it's 31% behind the state and local revenue of its surroundings. Allentown, looking about like Reading. Nobody ever tried in Allentown or Reading to pour money down the rat hole, is a phrase that we often hear about the failures of urban districts. Small cities have been more overlooked, actually, than the big cities. But there are a few big cities out there that have been severely deprived for a long time. Utica is one of those New York State small city examples. Bridgeport, Connecticut, another one. These are in here so you can look at it. But these are cases where nobody ever put a substantial infusion of funding into these districts that have long had far greater child poverty than the average of their surroundings. New Britain, Connecticut, Chicago. Chicago and Philly are the two least well-resourced, in relative terms, large city school districts in the country. They are now, they were 10 years ago, they kind of were 20 years ago. And the bottom line is that the school finance equation is what it always was. I found, you know, hopefully I'm not violating copyright here with my borrowing of this Captain Obvious logo, but I'm sure I am. But fair use last minute. So I've got the lawyer next to me, right? State and local revenue drives how much districts can spend. Federal remains a relatively small piece, though not irrelevant. How much a district can spend is really divvied up in that kind of simple decision about how many staff and at what price. It's a staffing equation. What's the wage we can pay? How many people do we need? Are we going to try to recruit and retain people with higher qualifications, or are we going to try to recruit and retain more of them? And how are we going to compete in our setting? And all of this is what ultimately drives us to the student outcomes we need. And even at state aggregate level, we can see these linkages, where if we look at the amount of, and this is one of the things we had to point out in that first school funding fairness report, is it's not just that wealthier states have more state and local revenue going out to their schools. It's not just the wealth. Yes, wealthier states do provide for more state and local revenue, but also the amount of effort that's put up matters. States putting up more effort, it's about a 50-50 split actually between wealth and effort. I guess 41% here for effort, but it's not that it's the remainder for wealth. There's some noise in there as well. So states that put up more effort have higher state and local revenue. Tax effort matters, and that's declined over time. When we actually look at competitive wage adjusted revenue and spending over time, it hasn't mushroomed that much. In fact, it's relatively flat for the last 10 years. Input price, meaning competitive wage adjusted state and local revenue, and current expenditure. And the amount that's spent fluctuates with the amount that's available to spend. Kind of a Captain Obvious here. It's not an incredibly complex equation that drives what schools have. And that translates to the fact that really staffing ratios also haven't changed much for the last 10 years. They've rebounded back to roughly where they were a little over 10 years ago. We've been stagnant. They went down a little bit through about 8, 9, 10, and then they bounced back up. The amount that states spend per pupil continues to drive staffing. States that spend more have more staff per kid. Kind of makes sense. These are all adjusted for kind of regional and local context factors, but states that spend more have more staff. And, there's this big kind of smokescreen issue of, well, pupil-to-teacher ratios have nothing to do with class sizes. They're totally different measures, except that the two are really related, right? The more staff you have, the smaller classes you can provide. And even the cross-state aggregate data show this relationship, be it for elementary self-contained classrooms or departmentalized middle and upper school classrooms. States with the higher staffing ratios per pupil tend to have lower class sizes per pupil. States that have higher adjusted spending tend to have more competitive teacher wages. And we're caught in the middle of that big debate now of, well, maybe we can just increase class sizes. We know a great teacher in front of 1,000 kids is as good as a bad teacher in front of 8, right? I mean, that's the kind of common rhetoric now. But getting that great teacher costs more, and the amount of resources you have available, even at the state aggregate level, does influence the competitiveness of teacher wages relative to non-teaching professions at same age and degree level. And the reality is that even if you wanted to trade off, pay higher wage for larger class size or smaller class size and lower wage, you can't make those trade-offs unless the money is there to make the trade-offs. You go back to Philly, Reading, Allentown, Chicago. Those districts already have lower wages at same degree and experience level and larger classes than everyone around them. What are they going to trade for what? You can't make the trade-off unless you have the room to make the trade-off. That's how, again, it's kind of simple the school resource equation is. And the reality, and I've got a bigger paper coming out about this, but we've got a multitude of measures of cross-state and within state over time, variations in student outcomes using NAEP data, using state assessment data renormed. And we do tend to find that the level of resources available as translates to competitive wages and staffing ratios relates to the level of outcomes, and the targeting of resources to higher need settings relates to the reduction of gaps. And I can take questions on that more later, but I want to give the rest of the people here some good time to talk about how this plays out at ground level and in actually doing the good things that need to be done in schools.